Hey everyone, I'm Andrea Ferretti and this is Yogaland. Hi Jason.
Hi, Andrea.
It feels like it's been so long since we've done a straight up Yogaland together.
Yeah, we've been kind of indulging in our yoga-ish episodes, which is good.
Yeah, it is
We've
good.
just needed to talk. But this episode, we're going to dial in to a little bit more like structured, official, yoga-based conversation.
Yes.
Yeah.
And just so people know, people have been saying to you, I've noticed in your Instagram feed, like, when is Yogaland coming back? I did just do an interview Yogaland podcast with Reggie Hubbard. So please go back and listen to that if you're looking for an interview format as well. It's a great conversation.
Yeah, and the next 6 weeks, including this week, are going to be Yogaland episodes because we're doing 2 series-based pieces of content.
Yep.
We're going to do a 2-part series, beginning with this one right now, really about implementing the most skillful educational strategies as yoga teachers and looking outside of the yoga tradition to other educational fields to understand how students learn best. And then we're going to do a 4-part pranayama deep dive to support and focus on the buildup of my upcoming pranayama training.
Yeah. We've got a lot going on, but first I just want to say you do have this pranayama training coming up. You're excited about it. We're excited about it. And there's a wait list already. So if you would like to know when it opens, registration opens, and when we have all the details up, go to jasonyoga.com/breathwork. But there's one more bit of content that I just want to throw in there because I'm doing that interview this week, and that is with the Love Your Brain Foundation. So they have a whole yoga program that they have a curriculum, and then they also have classes that are free for people who have gone through traumatic brain injuries or have various brain issues. And it looks amazing. It's all evidence-based. I'm really excited to talk to them about that. So that's coming up too.
I'm excited to listen to it because I've been hearing you talking about it,
Yeah.
but I don't know anything about this.
It's pretty fascinating.
Good,
Yeah,
good,
it's
good.
really,
Yeah.
I'm really on board with what they're doing.
Yeah. Oh, one more really quick thing. So we now have a video feed for our podcast. So you can, of course, listen to us on the podcast platforms. And that's the audio feed. But if you want a video feed of this as well, if you want to see our bright, shiny, smiley faces, you can go to Jason Crandell Yoga YouTube.
Yes.
And they're all released on the same days.
Yes.
Like, subscribe,
We are
all those things.
Getting it all together. We're getting our whole
Sorting it out together.
Yes, our whole
Yeah.
media. We're
Okay.
getting our meteor empire.
Meteor
That
Empire.
was like,
That's a good start.
well, that sounded a little bit like a Massachusetts way of
Yeah.
saying it.
All
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
Okay.
So, but today we want to talk about something that is near and dear to your heart that you've talked about for a long time. And that is this idea that yoga teachers can think like educators so that the learning really sticks. Yes.
Yeah. So, okay. As a yoga teacher, we have to not just consider what we want to teach, but how people learn, right? And I think as yoga teachers, we go through different phases of being educators. And I think oftentimes early on in our yoga teaching career, we're mostly just facilitating a good practice. Like, we're leading a session.
Yeah.
We're not necessarily taking the time to break down certain nuances. We're not necessarily taking the time to kind of weave in nuance or layers. We're just giving people a good practice.
Yeah.
And everybody, that is all good. Like, it is so good to just lead a good class. So I don't want us to think that every class has to be some deep educational breakdown. And that being said, there are techniques from the educational fields that help us as teachers understand teaching,
Right.
right? The actual teaching part. And one of the things I tell especially 200-hour trainees is, and this is so obvious, but we forget it. When you're a yoga teacher, your job isn't to yoga. Your job is to teach. So you have to really understand the mechanisms and the protocol of proper pedagogy and education. And when we take some time to step back as teachers and really think through what works educationally for a student to learn, for something to stick, then I think not only are we helping our students grow, but we're improving our craft.
Right. I mean, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head in that when you first start teaching, and I think this is the phase I was in many years ago when I was part-time teaching, you're really just learning to instruct and say the words in a certain order for a certain length of time. And it can be a bit of a shock to go from the yoga-ing to the teaching. So there is this period of time. I think what I hear you saying is there is this period of time where it's just absolutely natural that you're going to just learn to instruct. But that if you get to a point where it starts to feel kind of rote, right? That might be the time to really think about like thinking more as an educator and thinking about the pedagogy.
Yeah, absolutely. And one quick thing before we kind of go a little bit deeper into this, which is I don't even think you're right. It is how I set up the narrative. But if I can step back, it's not even a phase of time where we're just leading the class and then we get better and we start to educate the class. There are tons of classes I teach, especially on Glow, where I'm just leading a class.
Right.
Right. So I think what I mean by that is definitely early on, we're just trying to survive a
Yeah.
class. We're
Yeah.
teaching it. We're trying to survive. We're trying to hang in there. We're trying to have people like not be bored to death. We're trying to make sense. And we're trying to facilitate a good experience. And then when we get a little more comfortable and skillful at our craft, then we want to have the wherewithal to have some classes that are a little bit more educationally rich, and then other classes where we can just lead a good session.
Sure.
Yeah.
So yeah, and one of the things you point out is it's kind of making a shift
Yes.
from just speaking, the instructions to helping people absorb it better.
Yes.
So one of the first things you talk about is that people don't just learn by hearing, they learn by doing, seeing, and experiencing.
Yeah. So this is a really essential educational understanding and protocol, right? Is the learning process is not just a process of passive taking in of information. It's not just a process of listening. It's also a process of doing and a process of applying, right? Now, what I'll say is this is pretty baked in to being a yoga teacher because the thing that we are teaching is dynamic and it's kinesthetic. So when you're telling your students to inhale, reach up, yes, they're listening to you inhale, right? They're listening to your words, but they're also doing the action. So they're getting the cognitive influence, but they're also getting the sensory kinesthetic experience, which is great. But one of the important elements or one of the important layers that as yoga teachers, I think that we can do better is give students multiple ways of doing the same thing and having them explore the differences between the two. Okay. Now, everybody, this is different. This is actually different than just saying, okay, we're doing side angle pose. You can bend the elbow, take the forearm on the knee, or you can take the hand to the floor. That's fine. That's giving options. But what I'm saying here is something a little bit different, which is kind of like, and from being an editor, A/B testing, right? When at Yoga Journal, and you can talk about this for a moment, at Yoga Journal, when you would do cover tests, right? You would test A and you would test B, right? So this is what I mean. I'm going to give a perfect example. Okay, everybody, we're going to do bridge pose. We're going to do bridge pose two different ways. The first way, we're going to keep our feet hip width apart, our thighs parallel and internally rotated. Let's do that and let's see how it feels. Blah, blah, blah. Everybody does that, right? They come down. Then you say, okay, so now what we're going to do is the same pose, but we're going to do that pose differently. I want everyone to take their feet as wide as the mat and ever so slightly turned out. Okay, everybody, let's do it. You give the instructions, come all the way down. Okay, so now I want you to reflect on a moment and see if you had a preference. And in the third time that we do this pose, I want you to pick your preference. And I think a lot of times what happens in modern day yoga is teachers are either really technical or not at all, right? There's either like this kind of rigidity around technique, or there's technique doesn't matter, just listen to your body. Those, in my experience, neither of those are very good choices. Because as a yoga teacher, one of what I see my roles is to be an editor for you. And so if I can select, and I don't have to do this in every pose, but frequently, if I can select multiple ways that everyone does the same pose, different ways,
Mhm.
and then kind of reflect on that. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing again. Do which one you preferred. This is a much more sensing and feeling way of learning rather than memorizing rote technique.
Yeah. I mean, and I think it actually speaks to, it goes back to the one of the essentials of yoga learning, which is self-inquiry. So you're teaching people to do things two different ways and then observe their own inner experience so that they can then select their own way. And I think one of the issues I have with more rigid teaching over time, I mean, I think rigid teaching in the beginning can be really valuable for people to give them like a really strong structure. But then eventually you want people to be able to grow and know themselves so that they're not always just listening to what you're telling them to do, but that they can go have their own yoga experience on their own.
This reminds me of two quotes from Suzuki Roshi. The first one's a little harsh, though not really. And then the second one is literally exactly what you're saying. And both of these he spoke about when talking about teaching meditation and teaching about Buddhism. And these are both based in like a pedagogical challenge or process. The first quote is short and simple. Teaching Zen is not like training dogs, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not like training dogs,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now, the other one I think is even more kind of along the lines of what we're talking about here, where he says, the biggest problem for me as a teacher teaching Buddhism is that I may get good at teaching students what I know,
Mm-hmm.
but that doesn't necessarily help them know what they know,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so how do we do that? I don't think it's as open-ended as saying, do this pose anyway and just listen to your body. I think sometimes that can be fine, but to me, uh, th- that's too open-ended,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's kind of like if I came to your writing class and I was like, I don't really understand this technique or I don't understand this phrasing. You're like, well, whatever feels right.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't really help me.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What's going to be much more beneficial is say, okay, let's look at this. Let's look at two or three different ways of doing this thing.
Mm-hmm.
And as an educator, my job, like I said earlier, is to narrow the field for you,
Mm-hmm.
to not be rigid in a single way, but also not be so open-ended that there's no real inquiry or testing.
Right. Nothing to hold on to.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Okay. What about the importance of repetition? How important is that? I think we know the answer.
We know it.
How many times have we heard down dog and then we hear it anew again?
We know it. Okay, so let's start this. Two things. Number one, as yoga teachers, we are all, including myself, terrified of being boring.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think that's a really normal, natural thing, right? We stand or we sit in front of others and we want to keep their attention and we want to be engaging. And it's not just about us, but it's also, we want our students to enjoy their experience, right? Like, you know me, I don't take criticism well. There's layers behind that, but part of that is because I really want my students to have a good experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so what do we often do in this situation is we think everything always has to be new and different and novel. But when we understand cognitive load, right? And this is something that we can understand, and we're going to kind of talk about different pedagogical theories in
Mm-hmm.
our next episode. This is kind of like a broader how to help the information you're providing stick. When we talk more about pedagogical theories, one of the things we'll talk about again is cognitive load.
Okay.
And essentially, cognitive load is exactly what it sounds like it is. It means there is a specific amount of load or information that our mind can process in any given setting. And everybody, it's not impressive. the amount of things that we can really process and learn in one yoga class is not a lot. And so the power of repetition is so key because it allows us to decrease cognitive load and increase performance or
Mm-hmm.
increase skill,
Mm-hmm.
right? Now, there are different ways that we can do repetition, but I'm just going to throw out a couple of ideas for a single class, right? Because there's other ways that we can think about cognitive load and repetition when we think about like a month of our classes, but we can think about it in a single class, right? And you already brought it up perfectly. How many times in a contemporary, especially vinyasa-based class, are you going to do down dog, plank, chaturanga? A lot.
Yeah.
But how many times are you going to do warrior 2? How many times are you going to do warrior 3? How many times are you going to do bakasana? Oftentimes in any given class, not many times. So I think what we can do is take a step back and consider doing repetitions of the same pose, right? Not just plank, chaturanga, up dog, down dog, but let's go back to the first concept. And maybe what we do in every given class, in any given class, is we do warrior 3, 2 or 3 different times, different ways.
Mm.
We do half moon pose 2 times instead of 1 time, 2 different ways.
So do you mean like with 2 different sets of instructions, or do you mean actual different ways?
I mean, we could do 2 different sets of instructions or 2 different ways.
Okay.
Let's go simple example, half moon pose.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, everybody, we're going to do half moon pose twice. The first time, I want the fingertips to come to the floor or a block. You're going to strongly press down and you're going to reach the top arm up and turn the chest more. So as we do this pose, right, as we're instructing, the focus this first round is grounding, lifting, rotating.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you're grounding and lifting and rotating, you're not going to be focusing on the subtlety and the challenges of balancing in that pose. So maybe we do that same pose again, Ardha Chandrasana. And okay, now everybody's second time through, we're just going to make it a balance. So that bottom hand, don't bring it to the floor at all. Let's go hands together in prayer. You're not going to be able to ground and lift. You're not going to be able to rotate as much, but this time through, we're focusing more on balance.
Yeah.
Right. I think this is really key. And this strategy of incorporating greater repetition in a single class,
Mm-hmm.
something along the lines of a peak pose,
Mm-hmm.
right? This is one of the things that I kind of always got a little frustrated with peak pose. So oftentimes in a peak pose setting, people would spend, 3/4 or 4/5 of the class like developing the peak pose. And then how many times do we do the peak pose?
Once.
Like once?
Yeah.
It literally makes no sense.
Yeah.
I mean, with all due respect, and I'm not faulting others. This is a learning curve that I've gone through, right? So here's another way of thinking about it. The best preparation for any pose is often the pose, right? And so if we're trying to teach something like bakasana, right? If we select any more challenge pose that is more of a learning threshold pose, yeah, we need preparations, we need breakdowns, we need those things. But if I want people to develop the skill of bakasana, I can't then just do it once in a while,
Right.
right? I have to be like, okay, we're going to work on these peak poses. We're going to work on the bakasana poses. And we're going to do bakasana 6 or 7 times. Or maybe we do bakasana 3 or 4 times. Or maybe we just work on the transition in and out of the pose without even letting people get the feet off the ground, just kind of the setup and a little lean forward and transition a couple of times, and then repeat it full on a few times later. It's kind of like you have a dance background, right? Is that a little bit like learning choreography?
Yeah.
Or can
actually,
you make that analogy, right? So
Yeah.
it's like in choreography, you don't do the totality of the thing every time you do the thing.
Right.
Right? You break it down into
Yep.
small steps, right? And then you want to string them together. So in this scenario, whether it's a couple different variations of the same pose where we focus on different qualities and attributes, or if it's something like this where we're doing a more developmental pose, of course we're doing all the same preparations, but now let's actually do that pose several times. So there's greater total repetition
Right.
and skill development over time.
Yeah. Interesting. So, one of the things I feel like you do really well, especially when you're teaching a peak pose, is maybe teaching like one concept and applying it to different poses along the way.
Yes.
So, that could be another form of repetition.
Yes. Make sure I don't lose this thread. I want to say one quick thing. I want to refer to us being afraid to bore our students, right? Honestly, I hate to be materialistic and like yoga pose acquisition, but the most boring thing for a student over time is when they're not continuing to grow and learn new skills. And repetition is the surest way of actually developing a skill. And so that doesn't mean every class always has to be the same. We don't have to go to an extreme, but we do kind of want to say, oh, well, what is the best strategy to help my students develop, to continue to grow and to get skill and access? And I promise it's not being random and inconsistent. It's being consistent and repetitive and really having multiple repetitions of the same thing enough time that we get the wiring for it, right? Now you just brought up concepts, okay? So this is something actually I'm talking a lot about in my 200-hour training group, because we're at the phase right now where we're doing a lot of peer teaching, and we're still at the phase where I'm not wanting them to be too technical. We're still really at the phase where I want them to give 3 cues with good pacing per pose, right? And I'm not micromanaging their cue selection. So let's say they're in Warrior 2. I want them to say 3 cues: bend the front knee, lift the chest, reach the arms. I'm not having them be highly specific. And so they're at the phase where they're very general. But over time, and the point that we're getting to here, actually, the more in any given class we can focus our cueing on specific themes or regions, the more it's going to stick. So for example, let's say we're doing just a shoulders focus practice, right? We're going to do a little bit of everything. It's going to be a nice strong hatha class or a nice strong balanced vinyasa class, but I'm going to focus on shoulders, and we're going to have a little bit more of an emphasis on strengthening and opening up that part of the body, right? In that class, I'm not going to tell you what to do with your feet. I'm not going to tell you what to do with the knees. I'm not going to tell you what to do with the hips. I'm going to remind you to breathe here and there, but at least 90% of my cues in every single pose are going to be in the same region. So if I want to give you 3 cues in downward facing dog, I'm not going to say engage the quadriceps, lift the sitting bones, stretch through the arms. Those are good cues, but those are very generalized cues. And in this, the repetition that we want to build in, the like thematic repetition, is all about shoulders, right? So I at very least want to limit that cueing field to the upper body.
Right.
Okay, everybody, you're in down dog. Come a little bit forward to plank. Press the floor away so that you broaden your shoulder blades. Now maintain that. Draw back to downward facing dog. Keep the shoulder blades wide and elongate through the arms from the bottom of the shoulders. With the fingers, gently squeeze the yoga mat. You know what I mean? So
it's that lightens the cognitive load
big time.
big time.
And it also reinforces. It's also repetition, right?
Yes. And okay. And then I I just want to get back to the cognitive load issue. We have in our notes that the brain can hold about 4 to 7 pieces of new information at a time
Yeah.
before we get overloaded. So if you think about that in in reference to what you were just saying, if with class planning, um, you could think about 4 to 7 points that you want to hit over and over and over again in the shoulders and upper body,
I
right?
think even better, probably three,
Okay.
three or
Okay.
four.
Okay.
Okay, let's take a moment. I freak out easily. So as yoga teachers, those of you that are practicing and listening, if you're like, oh my God, I'm not doing these things, don't worry. We're just practicing. We're just practicing. One of the challenges that I have as a yoga teacher, sometimes, actually frequently, is I get really excited
Hmm.
and I want to say a lot of things. But when I'm saying a lot of things in a class, that's because I'm excited. And sometimes excitement is infectious. But if I'm like, bend the front knee, ground the outer thigh, press the front knee into the outer arm, lengthen the bottom waist, turn the chest, stretch to the top. I'm giving so many cues at such a rate that my students don't have the ability to do the thing before I'm on to the next thing.
Hmm.
And so I'm giving them too much cognitive load. I'm not only can they not think of all of those things, but they don't have time to actuate those things,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
Another common one. This is a little bit different, but I used to teach at a studio, and I would hear in the other class, which was kind of a fast flow class, I would hear this from many of the teachers: inhaling, and on the exhale, step the foot forward. There was no time to inhale,
Oh, it would be
right?
okay.
So there's things like this, right? There's like, it's cognitive load. It's the number of things that we can process in an increment of time.
Hmm.
But the other corollary to that is the rate of those things, right?
Yeah.
And so, like, here's a simple principle, and this is so hard for me to admit, and it is so hard for me to live by. And I can promise all listeners, I do not always do a good job of this, but I just do my best. Say fewer things to help those things stick.
Hmm.
And we might think to ourselves, well, but what if my students' feet aren't in the right position or knees aren't in the right position? That's okay.
Hmm.
Like,
Hmm.
honestly, it's okay. You can't teach everyone everything about every pose in every class.
Hmm.
And trying to do so is a really bad educational strategy.
Hmm.
So if we can trust saying fewer things, honing those things to important things,
Hmm.
repeating those things, and repeating those things across um, postural categories,
Hmm.
right? So in this shoulders example, they're in warrior 2. We just talked about they're in warrior 1, but now they're in warrior 2. Can I give them a foot, leg, and core cue? Sure. But you do that all the time. So how about we, in warrior 2, say, bring your awareness to the back of the shoulders, broaden them, reach through the pinky side of your hand, lift and broaden your chest. If we say fewer things that stick and we are consistent with those things, then they become learned,
Hmm.
right? And instead of being like that phrase, an inch deep and a mile wide,
Yeah.
right? And there's a time and place for that.
No, I think you're really honing in on something, which is when we're talking in front of people, public speaking, we get either excited or nervous. And when we get excited or nervous, we tend to talk more than we even do in our everyday life. And when you think about people's processing speed, especially in a yoga class where we're trying to, get more into the parasympathetic nervous system, saying fewer things makes total sense. Like they're not processing as fast as you are because they're not doing a presentation. They're not standing in front of 30 people having to present. But I think we get afraid to say fewer things because we maybe don't have a plan. But if you have a plan, like the one you've just laid out, it becomes easier to say fewer things because the things you are saying are valuable. You have a plan. You know what you're trying to convey. You know what you're trying to help them digest and process. And then you can kind of take your speed down a little bit.
Absolutely. And it's hard,
Right.
right? So one of the things that we can think about, everybody, is think about the process of teaching your class as a practice too.
Mm-hmm.
Your students are practicing, but you're practicing too,
Yeah.
right? You're honing your craft, right? And I want to reflect really briefly on two more traditional forms of hatha yoga, Ashtanga yoga, and Iyengar yoga, briefly with regards to this conversation. People that spent any time in a more traditional Ashtanga room can reflect on the experience and say, there weren't many words spoken.
Mm-hmm.
There weren't many cues given.
Yeah.
There were very few cues given, if any.
Mm-hmm.
The communication in these traditions was often manual, right?
Meaning physical touch.
Physical touch. And it was repetition of the sequence over time. And it was counting, right?
Yeah.
Like traditionally, you're not even told like what, like inhale, reach up.
Right. It was
It's a count.
dve.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a count.
Yeah.
So I'm not speaking positive or negative about either of these things, but it's just something to reflect on of like, oh, some of these historical traditions gave in like years of teaching classes, there would be fewer verbal cues given than in like the total amount of 2 weeks of some generalized yoga class these days.
Mm.
Okay. And then the other thing is Iyengar yoga, which is the most, I'm just going to say, the most technically nuanced, specific, and informed approach to hatha yoga. All of the years I spent with high-level Iyengar teachers, in any given class, you were really only trying to learn a thing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
There was these teachers were profoundly editorial, right? And so you would leave class having had a lesson.
Yeah.
And again, I'm not speaking for this or against this, but if there's some doubt within about some of these concepts, all we have to do is actually see that we in our lineages have historical precedents for these techniques. And I think that as yoga has become over the years more generalized, which I think there's a lot of good things about it, but as it's become more generalized, I think the way that we've thought through the structure and the educational techniques has sometimes taken a back seat.
Yeah. How about the cueing of asking them a question to like encourage self-inquiry, like bodily self-inquiry? How do you do that?
Yeah. Okay. So one of the primary ways that we learn is through reflection. And to be completely frank, I think these techniques lend themselves more to a workshop, a retreat, a series, or a training. So for me personally, I'm going to do a lot of A/B testing. Hey, everybody, we're going to do triangle pose a couple of different ways. How do you feel? Right? Let's do another one and do it on whichever one you preferred or found more interesting. So I do a lot of that work. I do a ton of repetition. I do a ton of thematic repetition, like we've been speaking of. When it comes to a general public class, I'm not as good at inviting people into a questioning conversation.
Okay.
Hey, everybody, we just did pigeon pose for 90 minutes on both sides. Tell me about how you feel. Reflect on that. I'm like, I might ask it rhetorically. Hey, everybody, we just came out of this. We did these a couple of different ways. Just take a moment and notice how you feel. Like, notice your mind, notice your body, notice your nerves, right?
That makes total sense. I think that's a good reminder for everybody.
Yeah. So, but I don't then engage in a back and forth,
Right. It's
right?
more of just like in reminding them to check in with themselves
Yes.
and how it feels
Yeah. And
because we forget to take that moment. We just forget to take that moment. So it's really just giving them a reminder to check in
the
inward.
totally. And the most, now that I think about it, sorry, the time that I actually do this pretty much in every class I teach is at the end of Shavasana or at the end of seated meditation. I will say, everybody take a moment and just feel how you feel in your body, right? Just take this in. Let this be like a sensory photograph or a sensory snapshot, right? Take a few moments. That's where I tend to invite people in. That's where I tend to be more overt about inviting you to process and attune to your experience. I think a lot of teachers do a better job than I do at doing this at the beginning of class. For me, at the beginning of class, I'm like, everybody jump into downward facing dog,
It's
right?
definitely not your style.
No, I like to just kind of like engage right away, right? Because when I go to a class, that's what I want. I want to reflect later. I want to start doing something sooner,
Yeah. Okay.
right? But I think in this scenario, teachers that ask their students to pause, to listen, to reflect for a moment, or to set an intention, these are all skillful ways. And then finally, in trainings, workshops, series, longer format situations, then I think we can take that a step further and have conversation.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, everybody. Okay, we just did this back bend practice and we did bridge pose and Urdhva Dhanurasana 3 different ways. Okay, everybody that really preferred it the first way, I want you to raise your hand. All right, what did you like about that?
Yeah.
Right? Then we can have a little bit more. Then we can have like a little bit more of an interactive, um, dynamic experience.
I like that idea because people do learn. Well, yeah, people, me doubting myself as I'm speaking, people learn by communicating their experience. We process things verbally, we can process things in writing, we can process things in the way that we think. But I think having to communicate verbally is a very effective way to learn.
And if you're a yoga teacher, it's how you get your footing. Right.
Mm.
So in a training, like in a training, you can't just be expected to go from the passive, I listen to my teacher and I do yoga, to now I am the teacher telling you to how to do yoga. You have to have these intermediary phases where you're like, oh yeah, I guess I kind of do like back bends with my hands a little bit wider than shoulder width apart. That felt a little less pinchy. I had a little bit more range of motion, but
Hmm.
yeah, blah, blah, blah. Then we start to have a more kind of overt and nuanced understanding of what we're experiencing, and we communicate it, and we get used to kind of sharing and describing experience without having to be teaching the class while we're doing it.
Hmm.
Right.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's also nice, just like you were saying, it's like, it's how we process feeling is to talk about it.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I feel like we've covered a lot of the technical things, unless there's something I missed.
No.
There's just one more thing that comes to mind for me, and I think I know what you're going to say, but it's just this. As a writer, when we were planning this episode, I was thinking people learn through stories. They learn through hearing other people's stories. That's so much of how we remember learning is when we hear an anecdote or a personal experience. So, how do you think that plays into teaching yoga?
It reminds me that if anyone wants a nonfiction intellectual book project, they should read Noah Yuval Harari's *Sapiens*,
Oh,
because essentially he contends, he's this massively respected historian, that he essentially contends that that Homo sapiens survived when all of the other um, similar species did not, because we learn to form narrative, and that narrative is the most efficient means of communication
Mm.
because it drives empathy and connection.
Oh my gosh, that makes me want to cry because sometimes I feel like what I do is, I don't know, I have a hard time contextualizing it as a contribution
Oh, it's a
anyway.
huge
But that
contribution.
makes me really happy to
Oh,
hear.
it's huge. It's huge, right? And he's a fascinating intellectual. Um, so okay, I I can think of yoga teachers who I have had, who I learned a lot from, but didn't have as deep of a connection to. And when I think about it, those teachers that I learned a lot from, but didn't have as much of a connection to, I heard a lot of techniques and I learned a lot of techniques, and they were really good communicators, really good sequencers. Um, but I didn't connect to them because I didn't get a sense of who they were in any capacity. And because I couldn't understand how their brain worked,
Mm.
right? For me, because I'm a very like tangential and tertiary thinker, it's normal for me if I'm teaching, Bastrika breathing, bellows breath, to be like, God, this reminds me of like when I was a kid. My dad, and my dad, he loves to make fires. Always going to make a fire in the Crandell family household. So
Yeah.
we had this leather bellows,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
So, like, if I'm gonna teach bellows breathing, probably I'm gonna be like, it means bellows. Okay, this is a really quick story. I grew up, I had this, my dad loved to make fires in a proper place. Don't worry, it wasn't that weird. We had this leather bellows and it went like this. That kind of imagery or that kind of story or that kind of narrative, when it isn't forced and
Mm.
when it is appropriate,
Hmm.
is really impactful
Hmm.
because number one, it makes a connection,
Hmm.
like it's more like humanness.
Hmm.
Um, and number two, uh, uh, with regards to neuroscience, I have no idea how it works, but the processing centers for story are a little bit different than the processing centers for black and white directive communication.
Hmm.
So we're by telling that story or giving imagery or metaphor, we're helping to land
Mm.
that information differently. And also I think it helps them like, if I tell that story about a bellows, right? Maybe for a moment they think about their child. It's coming up for me. This is the perfect example. That moment in Ratatouille where he tastes,
Yeah.
right? And he's just like, this
Yeah. Yeah.
moment,
Yeah.
like
Oh, his whole child. Yes.
his whole
He has his
childhood comes back,
memories.
right?
Right.
Because he has this taste.
Right.
So to me, it's a very similar thing as like, there's just something about narrative and story and imagery that not only lands differently, but also has this potential to, in that moment, help us as the student feel and connect to like a deeper range and connection to who we are.
Yep.
Right? It's like there's like a bigger thing going on than just grounding the base of my big toe in triangle pose.
Right.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. Usually hearing someone's story when it resonates, it's because, or when it sticks, I should say, is because it resonates in some way. So it reflects back to us our shared humanity. And I guess we're all narcissists because then we all remember it better.
Narcissists, maybe not.
I'm joking.
We are
I'm
the
joking.
center of our own world, probably.
And also just, I mean, I really was joking when
I
I
know
said
you were.
narcissist because it's also just like, again, it's that, oh, you understand me, I understand you. It's that just that resonance that we have
Yeah.
as humans that we forget about pretty easily. So story brings that back to us
Big time.
more easily. Okay, well, this was a jam-packed episode.
Jam-packed episode.
You might notice I had my iPad here in front of me just so that we didn't forget anything. And
I think we landed.
I think we landed the plane.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Jason. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We appreciate you. If you want to sign up to learn more when we've got all the information ready for the pranayama course that's coming up, you can go to jasonyoga.com/breathwork. You can leave us ratings, reviews. We love them. We love to hear from you. We loved when you share the episode. So just, we appreciate you. And until next week, enjoy your practice.